Curry was kind of deemed the most favourite dish of the nation in the 80s, but this was also the same time that the English Defence League were marching up and down the country, and where my family and I faced a great deal of racism. Hi, my name's Neha Patel Hampton, and I'm going to share a little bit about my family story. My parents are both Gujarati Indians and were born in East Africa, my father, and India, my mother. Both of them were born in quite complex times. My father was born in East Africa, in Tanzania, when it was under British rule, and my mother was born a few years after the independence from the British. I, however, was born and raised in the UK, and that came about as a result of quite an extraordinary journey on my father's part. So going back a couple of generations, my grandfather was actually hired as unindentured labour from Gujarat in India to move to East Africa to help build the British railways. I call it unindentured intentionally because the reality, of course, is when there is a colonial power overseeing a country, there often isn't alternatives or choices with employment and work and the ability to earn money. So when I say my grandfather moved, he moved because there was no other option for him. And so I believe in the late 30s, early 40s, he moved to Tanzania and actually lived and worked there for many, many years. And hence my father was born there. As I reflect on this moment, and because of some of the work that I do in my own professional life, I cannot help but consider these acts of moving people around the world, not just to East Africa, but also to other British colonies, as to some degree, some form of human trafficking and modern day slavery. And if you looked at the criteria that stands today, it's essentially a use of power to move people under false pretenses, which is exactly the situation. My grandfather didn't walk into an easy and comfortable life. He wasn't paid well. He was, if anything, somewhere in the pecking order in the hierarchy of society, the British obviously being at the top, the locals in Tanzania being perhaps in the middle, and the Indians and the outsiders being at the bottom of the pile. My father lived and grew up in Tanzania, so from his birth in 1945, he was there until he was 16 years old. And around this time, interestingly, there was a little bit of kind of movement in East Africa around independence from the British. And so my grandparents decided, when my father was about 17 years old, to leave and return to India. And returning to India for them meant going on a steamer boat, being at sea for 30 days, but moving their entire family back to India. My dad, as a young man, chose not to join them. And it was a difficult decision, but it's important to remember that as a young Gujarati Indian man, he was born into a country where no one looked like him. And so it's very easy for him to have that open mind and worldly view and think, well, I can just go out there on my own. He then joined the Scindia Steam Navigation Company, which was a form of like merchant navy, moving goods around the world. And he stayed at sea for a couple of years. He later docked into India, into his home country, one that he didn't recognise, one that he didn't find familiar. And even though he spoke the language, he never really felt at home there either. So the irony is that he's born into one country, returns to his home, but neither of them are home to him. And so with his British passport in hand, he decided to embark on a journey to come to the UK. Now, this was at a time when the Immigration Act, the British Immigration Act, talked about people like my father as British nationals. It was later changed where they are now referred to as immigrants. But at the time, my father went back to a British colony. Now, by then, Tanzania was independent from the British, and he returned to Zambia and lived and worked there for a couple of years with the intention of then moving to England, which he did in the 70s. Now, during all of this time, India obviously gained its independence, and that happened in 1947, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But whilst this is all happening, my mother's also born, and my mum was born in a small village in Gujarat. She was, in fact, 11 years younger than my dad, so she was born in 1955, and she was born, I guess, 7-8 years after the independence from the British. Now, you could imagine that this was a better time for her and for the Indian people, but the reality of the partition, the reality and I guess the leftover essence of the partition meant that they didn't actually find peace for a very long time, and to some degree there's still a lot of animosity between communities and people. And so my mother grew up fearful of Muslims. My mother grew up kind of almost feeling that aftershock of what happened with the partition and the civil war that occurred after 1947. So then coming back to join their stories, in 1978 my father returned to India on a visit. It's a complicated story, but I'll simplify. His marriage was arranged to my mother. They met just a couple of days before they got married, and in February 1978, my mum and dad got married. My dad returned to England. My mum joined him a few months after, once she'd finished her master's. And in May 1978, she was in the UK for the first time. Thankfully, coming into the spring. There are lots of fun pictures of her actually wearing saris and giant, great big coats with socks and sandals. It took her a while to shed the attire and actually adjust and adapt to the reality of living in a cold country. So my parents lived in Kent for the first few years of our lives, and then they moved to Sussex. And interestingly, they chose different locations to the rest of the Indian communities, which were gathering around Wembley, Southall, Leicester, and various other cities up north. My parents, again, maybe my dad's kind of worldly view, chose to put himself in amongst an incredibly white conservative community. So we grew up mainly in Eastbourne, a town where we had a very complex relationship with our community. Curry was kind of deemed the most favourite dish of the nation in the 80s, but this was also the same time that the English Defence League were marching up and down the country, and where my family and I faced a great deal of racism. It's not lost on me that this man, who was born in Tanzania, of Indian origin, went to India, came to England, but none of these places welcomed him and made him feel at home. And so in some ways, I think he always felt alone and without identity. And that's something that's very hard for me as his daughter to accept. He passed away many years ago, but as a young adult and as a full adult now, I struggled with how I felt about my British Indian identity. I'll just talk briefly about the partition, because it's a really important event that shaped a lot of what's happened around the world. And as many people will know, at a high level, British India was partitioned into what we know now as India and Pakistan. And that happened on the 14th of August 1947, which took place about 300 years after the British colonisation of India. I have incredibly difficult and mixed feelings about the colonisation of India for a few reasons. Firstly, because it isn't talked about, and the history has kind of been erased for people like me, and it feels important. And secondly, I can't help but always wonder what it would have looked like if a nation like India hadn't been cut off at the knees. For those that don't know, it's valued that India had £45 trillion worth of assets taken from it during that British rule. And that's so much to consider for a country that is now considered a developing nation. Talking just for a moment about the impact of the partition. it's really interesting that we obviously we talk about refugees and kind of mass human migration, but it's believed that the partition displaced more people than any other event in history. There were literally tens of millions of Hindus and Muslims who were forced to flee their homes. And it's often called the greatest refugee crisis in history. That division on religious grounds of Hindus and Muslims between Pakistan and India meant that a large number of Sikhs and Hindu Punjabis were moved from what was known as West Punjab to East Punjab. And then a lot of Muslim refugees were moved out of East Punjab to West Punjab. These are people that were forced to leave their homes pretty much overnight, leave behind everything they knew, their communities, their friends. And because of the divide on religious grounds, it caused so much animosity and conflict and hatred between families and communities that had always lived alongside each other. Talking about responsibility, the name Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India, is always the first that you will hear when you talk about responsibility for the independence of India and the subsequent partition. But there are divided opinions around who really drove the agenda, and I know that names like Jinnah and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel will also come up. And I think what's really important is that there were people with good intentions. There was power struggles. There were lots of complicated factors, but the reality is that the independence and the moment it happened in, and particularly the partition, left such a scar on India and Pakistan, and one that I don't believe has been healed even today. That animosity that exists between the countries still exists today. I won't forget to mention that Pakistan obviously later became independent from what is now known as Bangladesh, but that happened independently from the British partition. So what does this mean for my family particularly? So I said my father was born in East Africa. My grandfather left India when it was under British rule, and by the time he came back it was no longer British rule, so the effect on them was very, very significant. They were Hindus, they lived in a Hindu state, they didn't have to move, but that doesn't mean that the impact to them was any, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to say any less because that's not fair on the people that were forced to migrate, but the hatred and divisiveness that was caused out of those changes still lives on today, and it saddens me as I listen to my family talking about another religion in such a kind of poisonous way, and I think that history is still left within their psyches. It's not something that I believe in, but it is amongst my family and my elders and the people that I know that live in India, and that divide still very much exists amongst communities. My father obviously lived through British colonial times in East Africa and then again in Zambia later on, and he arrived in Britain as a British national. Does that mean he was made to feel like a British national? Absolutely not. The racism my father must have felt during his first months and years in this country are stories that I don't know, but I do know of many, and so my father's cannot be independent of that. I've talked about my view of the partition and my view of India, something that's incredibly important for me as I think about how we move forward from this. And it saddens me that in 2022 I'm still talking about how we move forward from this. But the reality is that history was written by the victors, and that's the British. I struggle with my identity as a British Indian, and I struggle to say I'm British now, because throughout my childhood I was made to feel like an outsider, and all I wanted was to be like everybody else. And the irony, of course, now is that now I know the story of my people and the story of other people. Being British doesn't feel like something I feel proud of. And so where I see the future going with this is a need to retell the truth, to acknowledge these stories, to make it part of our history, to teach our children. But part of that means that the British people and the British identity have to acknowledge what they've done. They have to acknowledge what they took from us, and they have to acknowledge what's happened as a result of that. And it's very difficult to move on and to feel comfortable and happy with myself if that doesn't exist. A classic example is that I live in a beautiful place just outside of Brighton, and not far from me is a monument called the Chhatri, which is a monument to Hindu and Sikh soldiers who fought in World War One on behalf of the British. The memorial it's a beautiful marble memorial of what looks like an umbrella. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous like monument where I go quite often to reflect on life and my father and many other things. It's celebrated as a memorial to soldiers, but what isn't really talked about is the fact that the Indian Army agreed to fight for the British in World War One in return for independence, which the British reneged on. That means all those lives were lost for no reason. The Second World War, also the British called upon the Indian Army, and they actually ended up being the largest representation of soldiers outside of the British in the Second World War. But again, they had to fight for their independence afterwards. What's also not talked about is why is this memorial in Brighton? The reason is that they used the Brighton Pavilion as a hospital for the wounded Hindu and Sikh soldiers. That sounds nice, doesn't it? But the truth is it was because they wouldn't mix whites and Indian soldiers in the same hospital. So the Indians were almost shipped away to be somewhere else. These are the stories that no one knows about. And I talk to my friends and my family about this story. But the reality is that I don't understand why these versions are not being talked about. And so a better society, a decolonized society for me looks like stories, lots and lots of stories where we can live and experience and understand our history. My history as a British Indian, the history of the people who may be part of the history of the British people, and an understanding of what that actually means. I have lots of mixed feelings about the idea of reparations. The idea that the British are at any point going to recoup the money that they took from countries like India, countries in the Caribbean, from East Africa, is obviously, it sounds absurd and it probably is never realistic. Do I think it should happen? Yes. Where do I think it should come from? The richest and the wealthiest who have benefited the most out of the history that we have. But do I think it's ever going to happen? No, sadly not. And am I realistic about that? Yeah, but I still think that our royal family, some of the wealthiest people in this country who have benefited from the slave trade, who have benefited from the colonization of India and Africa, have a role to play in the future, and they have to acknowledge what they've done and where their money came from. I have very complex feelings about the hoarding of wealth by certain individuals, and I think that it links into my thoughts about decolonization because I feel some of that money came from that process. But at the same time, I think that nobody should be so wealthy that the rest of the world is poor. And I think that that's something that needs to happen irrespective of my views on the history of India. My educational experience, ironically, as I grew up in a very white conservative town, me and my sister were the only Indian kids in our school. There was one black kid who was a couple of years older, but that was it. That was our whole school. And actually, I think that the one thing that didn't happen during my education, that is still not happening in today's education, is the conversation about this, is not just teaching us about Hitler, but teaching us about the British Empire. And it's ugly and it's scary and it's going to make people feel super uncomfortable. But I think that's what needs to happen, is people need to feel super uncomfortable. And the only true way that we can work towards anti-racism and decolonization is by moving and living through that discomfort. And so I hope that by supporting activities like this, and I hope that by telling my story, that someday these stories will be pulled together and will be shared and will be expressed and talked about. And I hope that one day we can move to a place where people like me who don't come from here know that the country I identify with is one to feel proud of. And at this moment, the divisive nature of our politics and the people still makes me feel like I'm an outsider on some level. So anyway, that's my story. My name is Neha Patel Hampton, and I'm grateful for the time to talk about it. Bye.